Life is experience, and longevity is, in the end, measured by memory. And those with 1,000 tales to tell have indeed lived longer than any who would embrace the mundane. Hi, I'm Koopa Hits, and boy do I have a lot of tales to tell. This first one is about the time I got lost in the woods, ran out of food, and had to fight Mother Nature's very own psychopath, the badger. Alright, so I just turned 19 at the time and was living with a friend and his parents. Some family squabble had arisen, as would happen from time to time, and not wanting to get involved, I figured it might be best if I made myself scarce for a few days, to let them hash out their growing conflict in peace. I decided to go on a camping trip I'd planned weeks prior, but had to cancel due to all my friends flaking on me at the last minute. You know how it goes. Since I already had a decent game plan laid out for this particular excursion, I figured it would make for the quickest exit. I told my buddy's dad where I was going and asked if I could borrow a fishing rod. He obliged and threw in a tin of bait and extra tackle, quipping how he wished he could come along to avoid the drama. Now, a bit about the place I was headed. I was already fairly familiar with the trail, having hiked it 2 times before with my dad and brother growing up, camping for a few days each time. Still, it had been years since I'd been there, but there was a reason I was going there specifically. You see, this trail was roughly 20 miles long. There were 2 lakes that sat along the first 10 miles of the trail, ending in a final lake above the tree line. All 3 lakes were regularly stocked with golden trout for fishing, and as intended, the first 2 lakes were regularly visited and fished, but that third lonely lake above the tree line almost never saw any traffic, partly because 20 miles is too long for most to do in a day, and partly because there were 2 perfectly good fishing lakes miles earlier. As a result, that third lake was teeming with trout that had never even seen a hook. What this meant for me is I could pack just the essentials, save the weight by taking no food beyond a small bag of beef jerky for the trail, with the knowledge that at the end of that trail I'd have as much fish as I could eat. You might be able to tell where this ingenious plan of mine could take a turn for the worse. Yet, with the absolute confidence that only youth can bring, I strapped my meager supplies to my motorcycle and rode the roughly 4 hours to the national park I was going to. I got to the trailhead parking lot sometime after noon, and actually did have the presence of mind to stop by the ranger station to notify them where I was going, and about how long I was going to be there, like you're supposed to. Only, I don't like being held to schedules, so I stupidly got a 2-week permit, though I was only planning on being there a few days to a week. I wanted to leave room just in case, I was having fun and wanted to extend. And so, satisfied with the buffer I'd given myself, and not really thinking through the potential unintended consequences, I set off on the trail at almost 2 p.m. Yeah, this story is just full of youthful mistakes. Hopefully anyone listening can learn from them, but in my defense, I figured it was fine. I still had hours before dark. I'd stop at dusk, set up camp by the trail, and continue on in the morning. But as I hiked, I got into a zone, I was determined to cover as much ground as I could, munching away on my small bag of jerky. When dusk came, I told myself that it was fine. I could still see, so I could go a bit further. The sun got lower, but I told myself it was fine. I could still see, and I could go a bit further. This repeated a few times in my head as the light dimmed until finally I realized exactly how dark it was when I walked squarely into a bush. Feeling a little foolish, I pulled out my flashlight, set up my tent, and passed out. The next morning, I awoke with the sunrise, spirits high and ready to keep moving down the trail. However, when I poked my head out, I found myself in a clearing, barely large enough for my tent, surrounded by dense forest and thick undergrowth. With no trail in sight, my gut instinctually sank, but I rationalized that I must have gone the wrong direction after running into that bush the night before. I was likely only feet away from the trail. Unfortunately, after circling my camp what felt like 100 times in ever-widening loops, I came to the sobering realization that I was nowhere near the trail. What's worse, I found no less than 10 game trails cross-secting my little meadow. Had there been only 1 or 2, I probably could have just followed each a ways down in either direction and found where they had come from. It's fair to say I had officially become unsettled. I sat against a tree by my tent to assess my situation, and hopefully figure out a solution. My thought process went something like this. Okay, given my pace, the hour or so it might have been too dim for me to know I wasn't on the right track. I'm probably no more than 3 to 5 miles from where I lost the trail, but it might be in any direction. They say if you get lost in the woods to stay put, I thought to myself, but then it dawned on me. I told that ranger I was planning to be out here for 2 weeks, and even though I had told my buddy's dad where I was going, I took off for odd lengths of time with relative frequency, so it was fair to guess a search for me wouldn't even start for 13 days. Now, I knew a person could survive 20-something days without food as long as they have water, but I also recognized that being a wiry 19-year-old with a high metabolism cut that time down. By how much, I wasn't sure, but I figured I had at best roughly a week from the time a search would start for me to my inevitable death by starvation. Needless to say, I did not like those odds. My next thought was to make a large smoky bonfire, since open campfires weren't allowed below the tree line. Any large amount of smoke would normally get attention, however, that thought only reminded me of the haze in the sky and the smell of smoke I'd become so desensitized to over the previous day of hiking. You see, it was wildfire season, and the smoke from the current forest fire, more than 50 miles away, made trying to get noticed with smoke signals an exercise in futility. All that left in my mind, at least, was only one option: go west. The idea was simple enough. I was on the west side of the mountain range. The highway I'd come in on ran north to south along the foothills of that same range. If I just went west, then, at most, it'd be like 20 miles to the highway, and from there I could hitch a ride back to the ranger station. It wouldn't be easy, but if I got lucky, I might even run into a fire road that would lead me to a paved one long before I hit the main highway. If only it had been as easy as all that. The first thing I had to deal with after packing up camp was my bottle running out of water. So, before I could go west, I had to get to the bottom of the valley I was in, as that was my best shot at finding a creek. Sure enough, though it took longer than I expected, I found it. After filling my water bottle using a filter pump I'd brought and finding a flat enough space away from the creek, I set up camp. Half the day had been spent assessing my situation and coming up with a plan, and the other half was pushing my way through underbrush down to the valley to get to the creek. The sun was getting quite low, and I had already learned that lesson, so I laid down in my tent, wishing I hadn't eaten all of my jerky so fast. As you can probably imagine, sleep didn't exactly come easy that night. I was tossing and turning, going over every possible outcome of my situation, but after a time, I did manage to pass out. I woke up day 3 to hunger pains. No surprise there. So I guzzled a bunch of water, both to hydrate myself for the hike and to trick my brain into thinking my stomach was full. Thanks, Magic School Bus. At any rate, since the creek bed I was near ran east to west, I actually made pretty good time that day. Not as good time as on a regular trail, but better than pushing through overgrown brush. Again, I set up camp by the creek for another fitful night of sleep, and woke up the next morning to continue. The hunger pains had mostly died down, but would occasionally flare up so bad I had to stop walking to let them pass. Other than that, half the day went rather well. I followed the winding creek in a generally westward direction for a few hours, but I suppose all good things must come to an end, and at about midday, the creek turned sharply south. I followed it until it became apparent that it wouldn't be turning west again anytime soon, if at all, so I backtracked, looking for a westward leading game trail. It took me well over an hour, but eventually I found one that suited my needs. I continued west after filling my water bottle. However, I didn't get far before accepting while game trails were easier to hike, they were so directionally unpredictable as to rarely be useful. So I made camp. I woke up on the 5th day to a sense of dread. However, it wasn't hunger pains, but a profound weakness throughout my body that brought me to a terrifying epiphany. A person might be able to survive 20-something days without food, but how long without food before a person no longer had the strength to walk? At that moment, I realized, whatever the answer, it didn't really matter. I could see the terrain sloping up, which meant I'd be hiking uphill against thick undergrowth with no creek to follow. Combine that with the weakness I felt, I knew pushing on blindly would likely be a death sentence. So instead of packing up camp, I scouted my surroundings and found a clearing that, lucky me, had a water source. It wasn't exactly a creek, but there was a large boulder embedded in the mountainside with water that had obviously been dribbling out of the cracks at the top for a long time, creating a small pool at the base, then cut a small clean line through the foliage, likely to meet up with that larger creek I'd followed earlier. I moved my camp and resolved not to continue on until I could find something to eat. As I laid in my tent, my mind focused on potential sources of food. Right off the bat, the creek I'd been following was much too small for anything other than minnows, so fishing was off the table, and the thought of trying to forage safe mushrooms and berries was laughable, since, with my lack of knowledge, I'd be as likely to poison myself as not. That really just left hunting or trapping. Since my only weapon was a fold-out buck knife, trapping seemed my best option. Luckily, I had seen a video on YouTube demonstrating a few basic small game survival traps sometime before. So I drew up every single detail of that video from my memory, and after some trial, and a lot of error, I managed to create a working sapling-sprung trap, with a bit of fishing line and a wood-carved stick trigger. Once I had the design figured out, next was the matter of making and placing several more before nightfall. From what I remembered of the video, I knew that I needed to place them on game trails, or ideally in front of burrows, identified by smallish holes in the ground. Aside from the test trap that was rather poorly placed, I managed to place 3 more. 2 were placed on small game trails a ways off from camp. The third, however, I set up in front of what looked like a burrow. By my estimation, it seemed a little too large a hole for the rabbit I was trying to catch, but I wrote it off, chalking it up to my utter lack of knowledge on the appropriate size a rabbit burrow should be in the first place. At any rate, I was exhausted and the hunger pains were coming back, so I didn't think too much about it. I just crawled into my sleeping bag and slipped into blissful unconsciousness. I was woken up suddenly in the dusk of pre-dawn to a sound I can only describe as an angry, chirping, snarling growl. Now, I was hoping to wake up to the sound of a rabbit in distress, which, if you don't already know, can sound like a screaming human. However, I had no idea what this sound was, but it was clear that whatever it was, it got caught in one of my traps. Once the fog of sleep cleared from my head, I was initially excited that I'd caught something, but not knowing what I'd hooked on my trap line, I decided to wait a little while longer, so that the sun was fully up. After what felt like an eternity, but in reality was probably no more than 30 minutes, I left my tent to check my traps, knife in hand. As I made my way past the first traps, it quickly became apparent that the commotion was coming from the furthest one, the one in front of the burrow. As the sprung trap came into view, I saw a 15 to 20 pound badger with its back legs up in the air and its front legs scrambling around on the ground. You see, I had catching a rabbit in mind when making this trap. The sapling I used was only ever intended to lift something like a 5 to 8 pound critter off the ground, and since the loop had unfortunately gone around the whole body and not just the neck, I was now facing an angry badger on a string attached to a stick. I stood there shocked for several moments as it growled and sputtered at me. It could really only run in circles around the sapling until it was too wrapped up to move except to go back the other way around until it had done the same thing in the other direction. I watched it do this a few times before hunger snapped me out of it. I slowly backed up a ways and then returned to my camp. Clearly I wasn't going to be able to safely kill this thing with just a knife. But with little option and the knowledge that it might wriggle free if I took too long, I hastily cut down a sapling about the right size and removed the branches and sharpened it to a point for a makeshift spear. As an added measure, I dried out my new spear tip over the fire's coals to harden it up. Another useful tidbit remembered from a video online. Throughout this process, I could periodically hear the badger making a fuss, only further reminding me of the urgency of my situation. At first, I briefly thought to somehow attach my knife to the tip of the spear, but when that thought occurred to me while carving the thing, I dismissed it out of hand, not wanting to risk damaging or losing my only blade if I messed up. And in the immortal words of that weapons guy meme, "You had stick! Stick very good!" After all, I could always get a new stick if the first one failed me. Anyway, after hastily finishing my sharpened stick, I made a mad dash back to the angry badger. When I got there, I was happy to find my quarry was more or less in the same place, running back and forth using his forepaws. At this point, my mind suddenly drew a blank, as it dawned on me that the only thing I'd ever killed before was a fish. Fortunately, almost as if my subconscious knew I needed it, the memory of an 8th grade biology lesson I had where we dissected mice flooded to mind. The teacher explained that mammal guts and organs are all arranged in basically the same way, the most important part to me being that the heart is under the left shoulder, behind the ribcage, and the bowels in the lower abdomen. This was important because, for one, I knew from somewhere if you accidentally cut through the bowels you could ruin the meat, but just as crucial, I now had a plan of attack. My heart raced and my palms sweat as I crept closer. Once I got close enough, I threw all thoughts aside in favor of focusing on my target, a small patch of fur just behind the armpit of its left foreleg. I rushed in and made a stab. That was when I discovered firsthand a badger's best self-defense mechanism: loose skin. You see, I had hit my mark, but with the downward thrust of my spear and thanks to its floppy skin, all I managed to do was momentarily pin a very angry badger to the ground without doing any real damage. That's when I learned the badger's second best defense: aggression. Rather than pulling away, it first bit and tore at the stick, then lunged at me, seemingly undeterred by the fresh hole I'd given it. The moment it bit the stick, I was already moving backwards, so when it lunged, I was thankfully able to jump out of its range. But that didn't stop it from pulling the fishing line taut and scrambling ferociously at me, unconcerned that its back legs were fully off the ground so far from his sapling tether. I pulled the spear tip up to eye level, and along with a surprisingly small amount of blood, I saw deep gashes where the badger had bit into the wood. A pit formed in my stomach as I realized if I messed up, that would be my leg. I took a deep breath and steadied myself, and resolved to aim for the top of the body behind the shoulder from now on. Even though I knew there would be more tissue to go through, I felt I stood a better chance of doing more debilitating damage and less chance of just getting skin. The next hour or so was a disjointed dance, the steps to which I was kind of learning as I went. There were several unsuccessful attempts lunging forward only to immediately have to retreat when the strike didn't land, so much so that I had to resharpen my spear twice during the encounter. Finally, however, the stars aligned and I managed to nail it. The point hit just behind the left shoulder blade, and using all of my adrenaline-fueled strength, I drove it all the way through its upper torso, pinning him to the ground for the second and final time. But I quickly found out this ordeal wasn't over just yet. I guess I hadn't really given it much thought, but I had just assumed when I stabbed it properly the fight would be over. The reality was far more sobering. I won't recount everything that went through my head, suffice to say that I felt a deep respect for this creature fighting so hard to survive, and no small amount of desire to end the suffering it seemed to be in, if its thrashing around was anything to go by. Almost without thinking, and perhaps with less care to its gnashing teeth than I should have been showing, I pulled out my knife and, while keeping it pinned to the ground with the spear in my right hand, I stabbed it under the armpit with my left, crouching behind it. I must have gotten the heart because with only a few more seconds of jerking, it finally fell still. The moment was surreal, a mix of emotions, crescendoing mostly in relief. I removed the spear and picked up the body, surprised at how heavy it was, and practically ran back to camp with excitement. When I sat down on the log I'd built my fire near, I set the badger by my feet as a wave of total exhaustion overtook me. After guzzling some water, I set myself to the grisly task of gutting and cleaning the thing. It was a much less difficult task than I thought it would be. All the insides came out easily enough, and although the heavy metallic smell of blood and viscera threatened to make me gag a few times, after inspecting the intestine and bowels, I saw that they were unpunctured and in one piece. I used some water from my little stream to rinse out the body cavity and dispose of all the guts except the heart far away from the camp, and after some debating with myself, opted not to attempt to skin it, but rather used my knife to shave as much fur off as I could before making a cooking spit. Before gutting, I built up my fire so that by the time I'd finished prepping the badger, it would be a large hot bed of coals. I may have been starving, but I still knew the right way to barbecue. Once I had situated the spit holding sticks on either side of the fire, I skewered the body through, ensuring that I threaded the stick through the meatiest part so it would rotate properly when I turned it. Since I was dreadfully hungry, I first cooked the heart on a stick and ate it. It wasn't great, a bit chewy, but not bad, all things considered. Just having something in my stomach other than water felt amazing. Next up, I cooked the main course, and I'll tell you what, I tended to that fire and spit with the attentiveness of a new mother caring for her first infant child. It wasn't long until I could smell the meat cooking, and after hungrily checking with my knife many times to see if it was cooked through, it was finally done. Now, I cannot properly express to you just how good it tasted, but at that moment, it was the best thing I had ever eaten. I knew it was just gamey, unseasoned meat, but to me, it was a golden brown sensation to the senses. While savoring my first meal in 6 days, it was like my brain was finally working again. I hadn't even noticed how erratic and foggy my mind had been the last couple of days, likely symptoms of malnutrition, but now it was like quiet had fallen over me again, and I could finally think right. I ended up eating less than half my meat that night and stored the rest in a gallon Ziploc bag I brought for my toiletries. And though I knew it probably wasn't the smartest move, I slept with the Ziploc bag next to my head in my tent. I figured I'd rather die by a bear attack than lose the rest of my precious badger meat. The next morning, I woke up with energy and hope. After an oddly satisfying breakfast of lukewarm badger, I filled my water, broke camp, and headed up the valley with more zeal than I'd had since the first day on the trail. I made camp that evening on the other side of the valley ridge, and just before sunset saw what looked like a fire road halfway down the valley. With excitement, that evening I ate all except one badger leg that I dried out over the fire to ensure it wouldn't go bad. I found the fire road around midday, and took a break to finish the last of my badger meat. Once on the dirt road, I made much better time. And just as I had hoped, by sunset, I found myself at a paved road with signage pointing me to the parking lot this whole thing started in, only 2 miles away. I set up camp one last time on the side of the dirt road, and by 11 a.m. the next day, I was back at my motorcycle, having spent 9 days in the woods. I checked out at the ranger station, not bothering to tell him my tale, half because I thought he wouldn't believe me, and half because I thought I might get in trouble for killing a badger in a national forest with no way to prove my life was in danger. So, that's it. If I had one takeaway from this adventure, it would be don't be an idiot. Stop hiking before the sun goes down. Or maybe bring extra food. I don't know. I'm no paragon. Figure it out for yourself. But if you like the story, I hope I've earned your subscription, and until next time, you stay saucy, Koopa Posse.